I can say for a fact that you have convinced me about the issue of racelessness. Before my conversation with you, I was of the opinion that race is biological. You can't tell me that race isn't biological. But I listened to your arguments and I listened to your positions, and I found that she's actually right. She's actually correct. And to that point, in a way, I actually believed what you were saying, but I wasn't able to articulate it in the sense of it being of racism creating race, because I listened to Thomas Sowell, and Thomas Sowell usually said something that the African Americans were not enslaved because they were Black. The justification for the enslavement came after that fact. So it wasn't because they were Black, that's why they were enslaved, you understand? So it is that demeaning or the racist attitude towards them that gave birth to them being classified later on as a separate race somewhat in America. And I understood that, I accepted that. Still, I accepted the opinion. I was of the opinion that race was biological. You can't tell me that I'm not different from a white person and all that. But I was able to engage with you, and you were able to change my mind. So that's a big plus for dialogue. So dialogue is good.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Charles, because that's not something you had shared before. And that makes me feel heartened that, I'm not talking and sharing and discussing these ideas with people for no reason, because I try not to look at it as, okay, my objective is to persuade people, right? I do look at it as my objective is to educate people. And if that education leads to persuade them to ascribe to a different position than they held when they first came in contact with me, then yeah, I mean, of course, I would see that as a fruitful thing, because of my conviction that the way racism and race currently operate in American society is enabling the same system of racism to continue to persist, right? And until we get our hands on it better and have more generative conversations about the problems and so on and so forth, or have conversations at all, then we will continue to stay in this quagmire, and more people than not will continue to be disadvantaged because of the way that we view each other. So to me, this begs the question of racelessness then, and sort of your view on whether or not Africans, and then of course you can get specific about like countries, tribes, ethnicities, etc. If you view Africans as mostly viewing themselves as raceless in the kinds of ways that I imagine, as in like outside of the bounds of racism, if you will, at least outside of the bounds of the Americans type of racism, what do you say about that now?
Okay, so the concept of race, it's more a Western concept. I mean, I am very familiar with the racial discourse in America because I'm interested in American politics. But most people back here who are not plugged into that worldview, who are not so keen in that worldview, would not have that. They wouldn't have that concept of race. For example, yourself, Dr. Sheena, if you were to come to Nigeria and to Africa, you would be called a white woman. You would be called a white person. But in America, you're Black. You're of another race. So for us, at times, it's we look at the countries of origin, or we look at the ethnicities of people and say, okay, this person is this. In my country, we have over 500 ethnic groups, and we have different shades of skin tone, but never to us has it ever occurred that we have different races. We have the people that are as dark as myself, to the Fulanis who are as light as maybe the Arabs up north. It's never been a point where they were classed as different races. In fact, two of the ethnic groups, the Hausas and the Fulanis, who are two distinct ethnic groups who somewhat look different, from each other. The Fulanis are lighter skinned, the Hausas are very dark. They sort of have merged in Nigeria to form a super ethnic group known as the Hausa Fulani, such that when you see a Fulani man, you can say that's an Hausa man. You understand? So the concept of race in Africa, it's not something that is as real as you would get in the Western world. It's not something that's as real. So when people out here look at everybody in the West, what we see, these are white people. These are white people. It doesn't matter the shade of their skin and all that, or you're American, or you're British, or you're Chinese, and all that. So you're referred to either by your country or by your ethnicity. That is the way that we refer to people from this neck of the woods. But for people who are more, the rise of social media, when people go online and see these things, they can now start, okay, in America, something like this is happening. Something like this is happening. These people are classed as different races. But that's not the reality down here in Africa. So in a sense, Africa is raceless, if I would say so. In a sense, Africa is raceless. So the tensions that you have between groups is more ethnic tensions and communal tensions or clashes, not a race-based tension or race-based clash. In fact, to tell you how the concept of race doesn't even make sense to Africans, Chinese people are regarded as white, Indian people are regarded as white, Arab people are regarded as white. But that's not the case in America. You get? That's not the case in the West. Those people are classed as different races, but to us, oh, you're white, and that's it. So it's interesting when you go out there to the Western world and you see all these classifications and sub-classifications, and it wouldn't make sense to the average or the everyday Nigerian or so.
So just to clarify, because I gather what you mean, because we've talked very briefly about this before, but when you give the example of me coming to Nigeria and being considered a white woman, is that because I have fair skin, or is that because I'm American?
Both. So even if you were a shade lighter, even darker, you're a shade darker, you would still be considered. In fact, those of us who marry Nigerians who marry white people, and they bring their kids back, their kids are regarded as white. Why in America they'll be black, but they're regarded as white, not really because of the heritage, but because they're sort of coming from a Western country. So it's when you look at the concept of the West, you just attribute it to these are white people. These are white. Right. Yeah.
It's interesting that because you mentioned that Chinese people would also be viewed as white. Does that apply to all of the groups who are racialized as Asian in the American context? Are they racialized as white?
Yes.
Is there a reason for that? Because I don't tend to connect most countries in Asia with the West, if that makes sense.
Yes, you would not connect. You wouldn't connect most countries in Asia with the West, but here we're looking at overseas versus in the continent of Africa. You understand, and also to the point that almost everybody outside of Africa is lighter than us. So right. By that default, they are white people.
Now let's complicate this a little bit. So we know that in many places, even if in most places on the continent of Africa, race operates where it exists, because I see race language, like the concept of white and so on, exists in use, but it's obviously very different from how it's used in America.
Yes.
What about the people, because I could point to South Africa as the best example of how race and racism do seem to travel there as a sort of connection to how it is in America. So what about, do you have any thoughts on like how are the white Africans racialized, if at all?
Okay, so it's good that you mentioned South Africa, because South Africa is sort of a unique case in Africa. You can remember that up until 1994 there was apartheid in South Africa, and that was strongly tied to the West. In fact, it wasn't the Africans doing the racializations. It was the Europeans who were in South Africa who brought in the racial categorizations. Because in South Africa you have a lot of categorizations. The Indians, there are different racial categorizations in South Africa. So in that case, South Africa is unique. It is unique in that regard because it was much more aligned with the Western concepts of race than the rest of Africa, than other parts of Black Africa. And yes, you can still see today that a large proportion of South Africa has white people, indigenous white people, indigenous in quotes, because they are descendants of white people who have been there for, say, for centuries and all that. So in that sense, it is not an African racialization. It's a continuum from the Western concepts of race language that you see in Europe, that you see in America. That was what was domiciled in South Africa, but you don't find in other parts of Africa.
Yeah, that tends to be how I think of it too. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on all things, global. I focus on the Americas and the Caribbean mostly. But as part of my exploration of different philosophies of race, I have gone outside of the space of America to examine, does race and racism travel? And where I find that it travels, as in where it also exists in a similar way to the American context, it is spaces like South Africa, who have a clear colonialist, imperialist, history in the same way or similar way to how travelers came and took made the Americas into the countries that they are now. And in that way, I think it's important, because if we recognize how looking at race and race, what I call racialist language on a global context, and if we come to find that the spaces where race and racism travel, as it is in America, we come to find that those things exist in similar or the same ways in spaces that have a similar history, but outside of those spaces, because not all of Africa has been colonized, right? Not all of Africa has been subjected to the will of Europeans, if you will. So if that's true, I think that we can learn something from the fact that race, i.e. racism, don't exist everywhere. And where they do exist, there are shades, pun intended, of difference. Because like even in South Africa, at a very cursory research level, I learned that there are generally 3 categories. It's something like white, black, and colored. And that colored means something very different from what it has meant in the American context. And I'm like deeply interested in doing more research to figure out how race works there. But I think outside of examples like that we could point to in Africa, what you're saying rings true, because we have other writers, Nigerian writers included, like Chimamanda Adichie, who has the book Americana, in which she's exploring the fact that in Nigeria, the characters view themselves a particular way. Then one goes to London and one goes to like LA or something like that in the United States. And they both experience different things. and they both experience being sort of put into or subsumed by the racialist cultures around them in different ways. I don't know. I guess I say that to say the more we can relativize the existence and persistence of race and racism by looking at different places and looking at different times, I think it can go a long way toward expanding our understanding of how it works in America. Because to my mind, if we look Americans, we being Americans, if we look at Africa as the birthplace for Black people and Blackness, but then we come to find that most people from the continent, all different countries, don't view themselves as that. Shouldn't that mean something? Like, can't we learn something from that? What do you think about? Am I just talking nonsense? What do you think about
Oh
that?
no, you're not. You're not talking nonsense. And it's good you mentioned Chimamanda Adichie, because I think I should have mentioned her as one of my influences. So I read her book Half of a Yellow Sun when I was I think I was in undergrad, no, before I got to university. She's a beautiful writer. She knows how to use words. She knows how to capture emotions with words. So yes, so she is one of my influences too. Yeah, and to the point that she made that when we from the continent go to the west, at times we get confused with the whole racial discourse and the whole racial tensions and all that, because we just feel that all we see when we look at the West is a land of opportunities. That's what we see when most people that live here, once they're going to the West, what they're going to look for is a land of opportunity. They're going to look for better opportunities for themselves, financially, educationally, and all that. So they're not thinking in that sense of, when I get there. In fact, Vincent, who is a Nigerian, is a British-born Nigerian. He comes to my channel too. We've had discussions and before, and he's currently studying in America. And he told me that when he got there, that some of the white people called him and told him that when they noticed that he was an immigrant, they called him and told him that he shouldn't be like the Black Americans or the African Americans. You get. And he also had similar comments from the African Americans about the white people. So he was thrust into that sort of racialized condition where it didn't actually mean anything to him coming there. When he got there or going there, he did not, okay, I have to start aligning with African Americans because we have the same racial or ethnic this thing. I have to. No, that was not his thought. It was in America there that line of thinking got ingrained into him. That's why probably first generation immigrants are usually much more attuned with their home country, and by the second or third generation, they started seeing themselves as African Americans, because somehow the environment changes you, the culture around changes you, and you start seeing yourself in that racialized way. But aside that, it's not something that occurs naturally to us without being sort of prompted into it. Yeah. So you were saying we're making perfect sense. Yeah.
Do you think so? Even earlier, you mentioned how before we started having conversations, you weren't necessarily initially persuaded by my theory of racelessness, right? Which cuts two ways. It speaks to what a person thinks race is, and it speaks to what a person thinks should be done with race. So in my instance, I argue that the thing that in American society we point to when we say this is race or this is racial, we say it's a social construction, but we talk about it in terms of nature, in terms of biology and all that other stuff. And I view it as a skeptic, which is to say that what we point to as race or racial in the US is actually racism camouflaging itself as race. Or so examples of this, right, would be if somebody tells me that I'm talking white or I'm trying to be white, right? Kind of interpreting and figuring out what does a person mean by that and what kind of power imbalance or dynamic are they writing into race. There's a hierarchy there, right? And then, or it's something ethnic or it's something cultural that's being misnamed as race or racial. Because to your point, Africans, broadly speaking, are extremely diverse. You know, we have diverse cultures, we speak different languages, we live in different nations, we have different ideas and ways of viewing the world. And so for something to be racial, then truly, one would think, if we follow that logic, that it would apply to the majority, if not every racialized Black person. So there's a way in which my skepticism speaks to this idea of racelessness, because ultimately I view us already as being raceless. But I recognize that people view it as something of nature. Like you said, thought it was biological, right? Or I recognize that some people view it as a social construction. And in that way, I argue that we need to eliminate the concept of race with the express purpose of undoing racism. That this debate about CRT, all of that stuff that's going on, some of the ideas of that's being called anti-racism are actually allowing the problem of racism and division in the United States to persist and even deepen. So in those ways, I talk and think about racelessness, but I also recognize that in some spaces, like for you, when you spoke about thinking it was biological, to you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but to you and from what I've heard you say, I interpret that as meaning something very different than what Americans think race is, right? Like for you, it seems more of a matter of fact, a statement, if you will, as opposed to signifying some kind of solidarity, diasporic solidarity, or some kind of cultural sameness, right? Like for you, it seems more descriptive versus carrying all that other stuff. Is that accurate?
Spot on. You're spot on. You're very correct in that analysis.